All right, so are you ready to jump into something a bit different today?
Oh, yeah. Always up for a challenge.
Okay, good, good.
Okay.
So, you've all sent in so much material about anarchism.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, and it's not just, the typical surface level stuff.
Right.
We've got blog posts, we've got some, deep philosophical dives, even a surprising connection to a certain well-known religious figure.
Definitely going to keep us on our toes.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. I think, when a lot of people hear the word anarchy, they just
Well,
immediately picture
chaos.
chaos and violence.
Right.
Like just a complete breakdown of society.
Yeah, it gets a pretty bad rap.
It does.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to it than that.
Right.
Right.
There is.
So maybe we should start by trying to define it a little bit better. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good place to start would be this Finnish blog post you sent in.
Okay.
The title is Funs sitta and Arkismista, which roughly translates to food for thought about anarchism. And the author, Juka, does a really good job of addressing this common misconception. Like you said, people hear anarchy and they think chaos and violence, but Juka really argues that, anarchy at its core simply means no rulers.
So instead of a system where all the power is concentrated in the hands of a few at the top,
Exactly.
it's about distributing that power.
Yeah, to the individual.
Okay, to everyone. So more of a grassroots, bottom-up kind of approach.
Exactly. He actually uses a really interesting analogy in the post to kind of illustrate this point. He talks about American action movies,
Okay.
where anarchy is, always portrayed as this like lawless, free-for-all.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. With the warlord inevitably rising to power and taking control.
Right, exactly. But Juka's point is that this completely misrepresents, what true anarchists actually believe in.
Right, because in that scenario, you're just replacing one form of authority
Exactly.
with another.
Right. It's not really true freedom.
Okay. So is he saying that there's no place for violence or coercion in a true anarchist society?
Yeah, he actually calls out certain groups like Antifa or Black Bloc who sometimes claim the anarchist label,
Okay.
but he says they actually contradict its core principles.
Because they're still trying to force their views on other people,
Exactly.
which goes against that whole idea of individual freedom.
They're just replacing one form of authority with another,
Right, right. So it sounds like this Juka guy is speaking from a really personal place here.
Yeah, definitely. He describes himself as a retired farmer, programming and embedded engineer, anarchist in the original sense of the word, for life, peace, truth, freedom, and justice.
Wow. So it's not just an intellectual exercise for him. It's like a way of life.
Absolutely. And it's clear that he's put a lot of thought into this.
Okay, but, even within the world of anarchist thought,
Sure.
there's a whole spectrum of different views,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I'm curious, how does he address that?
He does touch on that in his post. He mentions, you have your anarcho-capitalists, you're an anarcho-communist, you're anarcho-syndicalists.
Right.
But yeah, it is a good point that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to anarchy.
So that kind of brings up an interesting question for me. If anarchy is all about this individual freedom, and no one can be forced to do anything against their will,
Right.
how do all these different, sometimes conflicting viewpoints actually coexist peacefully?
It's a great question, and one that I think we should definitely come back to as we explore these sources further.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question.
It is, but before we get to that, there's another really intriguing point that Juka makes in his blog post that I think we should talk about.
Okay, lay it on me.
So he argues that there's actually a well-known text that lays out a blueprint for, a rulerless society,
Okay.
but it's often overlooked for its anarchist implications.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What text are we talking about here?
The teachings of Jesus.
Whoa, that's not what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about anarchy, but
No, not really?
Juka makes a pretty compelling case.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what's the connection?
Well, he points specifically to the golden rule.
Okay, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Exactly. And he's suggesting that that's essentially, an anarchist principle in disguise.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. If you don't want to be coerced or controlled by others, then it follows that you shouldn't coerce or control others.
Okay.
And that inherently, rejects the legitimacy of any kind of authority figure, whether it's a king or a president or even just a majority vote.
So he's saying that if you actually live by the golden rule, you're already embracing a fundamental principle of anarchism.
In a way, yes. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and autonomy of every individual.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea. But it makes you wonder if a society built on that kind of, like, radical empathy could actually function.
Right. And that's where I think this next source that you sent comes in. Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov.
Ah, Dostoevsky. Always a good choice for a deep dive into, like, the messy complexities of human nature.
Right. There's a particular chapter in the book titled The Grand Inquisitor
Okay.
that's especially relevant to our exploration of anarchy. And without giving too much away, it essentially explores this tension between individual freedom and then the human desire for rules and dogma.
So it's kind of like playing devil's advocate to Juka's argument about the golden rule.
In a way, yes. It suggests that people, they often crave structure and certainty, even if it means sacrificing some of their freedom.
Right, like that need to feel safe and secure.
Exactly. And so it raises the question of whether, humans are even capable of handling the responsibility that comes with true freedom.
That's a heavy question. And it kind of brings us back to that earlier challenge we were talking about, right?
Right.
Like, how does an anarchist society deal with people who might harm others if there's no system of punishment or control?
Yeah, it's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think it's time to introduce another voice into our conversation.
All right, I'm ready for a new perspective. Who are we bringing in?
Let's talk about Alfie Kohn.
Okay.
He's an author and speaker who's done a lot of work on the detrimental effects of competition.
Competition. How does that tie into anarchy?
Well, remember, Juka's blog post also includes a pretty strong critique of modern society,
All right.
especially the ideology of neoliberalism,
Okay.
which, as you know, puts a lot of emphasis on competition as the driving force for progress.
Right, right.
And Cohn's work adds another layer to this critique.
Okay, I'm listening.
So he challenges this very basic assumption that competition is inherent to human nature. He actually argues that it's more of a product of scarcity, meaning that when resources are perceived as being limited, we tend to see each other as rivals. And that's what leads to all the conflict and inequality.
So he's saying that competition isn't some, like, fundamental human trait. It's more of a learned behavior
Exactly.
that's reinforced by the systems we live in.
It's a product of the environment. And this ties directly into Juka's critique of neoliberalism,
Okay.
He sees this ideology, which prioritizes individual gain and the free market above all else, as being like fundamentally opposed to anarchist principles.
Right, because it sets up this kind of dog-eat-dog world.
Exactly. And that's the opposite of what anarchism is all about, which is, cooperation, mutual aid, and individual empowerment.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how all of these pieces fit together now.
Hmm.
But I do want to circle back to Juka's blog post and his critique of modern governance.
Sure.
What specific systems is he calling out?
Well, he makes this kind of satirical observation that bureaucracy seems to believe the best solution to problems created by bureaucracy is more bureaucracy.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
It often feels like these institutions just get bigger and more complex without actually solving the problems they were meant to address.
Exactly. And he points to things like the EU and NATO
Okay.
as prime examples of this phenomenon.
So even these organizations that are, supposedly promoting peace and cooperation are actually perpetuating these power structures that anarchism seeks to dismantle.
That's one way to interpret it, yeah. And it's actually in this context that Juka introduces another really important concept, the post-totalitarian system.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that term. Can you break that down for me?
Yeah, so it was coined by Václav Havel, a Czech writer and dissident who
Sure.
later became president.
Okay.
And he argued that in these post-totalitarian societies, the state essentially functions like a religion.
Yep.
It suppresses dissent, and
Yeah.
demands this unquestioning loyalty.
So control is maintained not through, like, overt force,
Right.
but through these subtler forms of coercion and manipulation.
Exactly. It's like a more insidious form of authoritarianism. And Juka seems to be implying that we might be living in such a system right now.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. Okay, this is getting really interesting. I think I'm ready to dive even deeper now.
All right, let's do it.
So, as we're going through all of this,
Yeah.
it's making me, like, really question some of my own assumptions about how society works.
I mean, that's kind of the point of a deep dive like this, right? It's like to make you think, question things.
It's definitely like a mind-bending experience. And one of the things that's really stuck with me is this whole idea of a post-totalitarian system.
Yeah,
It's kind of freaky to think that we might be living in a society that's like subtly manipulating us into conforming.
right. And it makes that call for disobedience that Joka talks about
Yeah.
even more potent, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
But it also makes you wonder, is anarchy even like a realistic alternative?
right.
You know? Is it just some utopian dream?
It's the big question, right?
Yeah.
I think, if we look at both, Juka's blog post and Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor,
Yeah.
they kind of offer some insights into this, into how realistic it might be.
Okay, so how do they do that? How do they shed light on whether or not anarchy is actually feasible?
Well, Juka argues that the biggest threat to power is disobedience.
Okay.
It's about refusing to conform, you know, questioning authority,
Okay.
asserting your individual sovereignty. He seems to think that through those actions, we can kind of start to chip away at these systems of control.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful idea. But I mean, Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor kind of paints a much more like pessimistic view of human nature, right?
It does. It does. It suggests that humans might actually crave,
Yeah.
structure, certainty,
Yeah.
even if it means giving up some of their freedom.
So it's like there's this inherent tension within us
Right.
between like wanting to be free,
Yeah.
but also wanting to feel safe and secure.
Exactly. And that tension is really at the heart of this whole debate about anarchy, right?
Right.
Like, if humans are naturally inclined to seek out authority figures, rules to follow,
Yeah.
is a truly rulerless society even possible?
It makes you wonder if like the fear of anarchy
Yeah.
is really just a fear of freedom itself.
That's a good point. And it gets to the core of, what anarchy is really about. It's not just about dismantling those external power structures. It's about those internal beliefs that we have about authority and control.
So it's not just a political revolution, it's like a personal revolution as well.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes, Juka's blog post so compelling is that he's not just talking about some abstract political theory. He's talking about a way of life,
Right.
a way of being in the world.
Yeah. And it kind of all comes back to that idea of the golden rule, doesn't it?
Oh.
Like treating others the way you want to be treated.
Absolutely. That seems to be, kind of the foundation of his whole worldview.
Okay, but how do you actually like put that into practice?
Right.
How do you go from individual acts of kindness
Yeah.
to like a systemic shift in power dynamics?
Well, I think Alfie Kohn's work on competition
Okay.
offers some clues here.
Okay, so remind me how Cohn's ideas fit into all of this.
So if you remember, Kohn argues that competition isn't inherent to human nature,
Right.
but it's actually more a product of scarcity.
Okay.
So he believes that if we can create a society where everybody, feels safe and secure,
Yeah.
where all their needs are met, then that need to compete would kind of naturally diminish.
So it's about like shifting from this mindset of
Yeah.
scarcity
Yeah,
to a mindset of abundance.
exactly.
Okay.
But, that requires that we dismantle all of the systems
Mhm.
that perpetuates inequality, that create that, artificial scarcity.
Which kind of brings us back to Juka's critique of neoliberalism.
Right.
Because he sees that ideology as like a major obstacle to achieving a truly anarchist society.
It is. Because neoliberalism is so focused on competition and individual gain, it inevitably creates a system where people are constantly trying to get ahead, often at the expense of others.
So it sounds like Juka isn't just advocating for a change in government. He's advocating for a fundamental shift in like our values and our beliefs.
Yeah, he's calling for a paradigm shift.
Okay.
Moving away from competition towards cooperation, from individualism to more of a community-based approach.
But that sounds like a pretty monumental task.
It is.
Like, how can we even begin to hope to achieve that kind of like radical transformation?
Right. And Juka suggests that the solution lies not in, trying to reform these existing systems from within, but rather in creating alternative structures
Yeah.
based on these anarchist principles.
So almost like building a parallel society.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting, because anarchy isn't about imposing like a single rigid ideology.
Right.
It's about empowering individuals and communities to create the kind of society that they want to live in.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all approach to anarchy. It can take many different forms.
Exactly. It's incredibly dynamic and adaptable. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you have your anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-communists and, anarcho-syndicalists.
Yeah,
Each of these groups has a different idea of what a rulerless society would look like,
right.
but they're all united by that core principle of individual sovereignty.
So it's less about finding the one right answer
Yeah.
and more about like exploring all these different possibilities.
Absolutely. And that's where you, the listener, come in.
Right.
All these sources that we've been talking about, they're really giving you the tools to think critically about the systems that we live in, and to imagine alternatives.
It's about empowering us to become like active participants in shaping the future
Right.
rather than just passively accepting the status quo.
Exactly. And so, as we head into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we just want to encourage you to, keep these questions in mind.
Okay.
If you could design a society without rulers, what would it look like? What values would it be based on?
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly, what role would you play in making that vision a reality?
Okay. Lots to think about. I gotta say, this whole exploration of anarchy has been, it's been surprisingly liberating.
Yeah.
Like, it's really made me question a lot of stuff that I just took for granted about how society works.
Right. It's like a mental reset,
It is. And one of the big takeaways for me is just how diverse anarchist thought really is.
Mm-hmm.
Like we were saying before, you get your anarcho-capitalists, your anarcho-communists, your anarcho-syndicalists.
Right.
Like, it's not about finding the one right answer. It's about embracing all of those different perspectives and ideas.
Yeah. That's one of the things that makes it so hard to define,
Yeah.
It's not a fixed system, it's a process.
Yeah, it's constantly evolving.
Which can be frustrating if you're looking for, some clear-cut definition or set of rules.
Right, yeah, I can see how that could be a barrier for some people. It's a lot easier to, like, latch on to a concrete ideology with a specific set of beliefs and goals.
Definitely. But, that ambiguity is also what makes it so adaptable and resilient. It
Right.
can't be easily controlled because it's not bound by any, rigid dogma.
Right, it's like a constantly shifting landscape.
Exactly. And that's why, Drucker puts so much emphasis on disobedience as that tool against power structures.
Right.
It's about constantly questioning, challenging, subverting the status quo.
So it's not just about tearing things down, it's also about building something new.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to that question we posed earlier.
Right.
If you could design a society without rulers, what would it look like?
Right, and I think that's a question that everyone needs to really grapple with
Yeah.
if they're seriously interested in, exploring anarchy, because it's not just something you read about, it's something you participate in.
Absolutely. It requires you to, confront your own beliefs about authority, about control,
Yeah.
and ask yourself those tough questions like, what am I willing to let go of? What am I willing to fight for?
And that's where it can get really uncomfortable
Right.
because it forces you to really examine your own role in these systems.
Absolutely. But it also, it opens up those possibilities for radical personal transformation.
Okay.
Because, to create a truly free and just society, you have to start by liberating yourself.
I love that. It's not just about changing the world out there, it's about changing the world within.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes, this whole deep dive, and in Juka's blog post especially, so powerful.
Yeah.
It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's a call to action.
It's a challenge to really question everything, to embrace your inner rebel, and to dare to imagine a world where power resides not with rulers, but with the people.
A world where cooperation triumphs over competition,
Yeah.
where empathy guides our actions, and where individual freedom is balanced with, a deep sense of responsibility for the collective.
That sounds like a pretty amazing world.
It does.
Even if it seems, kind of far off, it's still worth fighting for.
It is. It is.
And who knows, maybe by just taking those small steps,
Yeah.
Challenging the status quo in our own lives,
Yeah.
we can create those cracks
Right.
in the foundation.
Exactly. Cracks that could lead to real change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into anarchy,
Yeah.
we just want to leave you with this. Embrace that inner rebel, question everything, and don't be afraid to imagine a world where true freedom and justice prevail.
Because the future isn't predetermined.
Yeah.
We get to create it.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.